As someone who grew up in Florida, I know there are some very big differences between what it's like living in Florida and living in Georgia. Even though these two states border each other, there are some big differences. And so let's talk about what those differences are in case you're considering either one of these two states to live in. We're going to talk about all kinds of topics like the climate and the insurance issue and taxes, the economy, education, traffic, the housing market. We're going to talk about all of these things. So let's start off with the climate. Obviously, this is one of the biggest differences. So like in Miami, where I'm from, where I grew up, the temperature there is always hot as hell. It is never really a break. Maybe there's like a couple weeks in January where the temperature kind of dips down below 80 degrees. I'm just kidding. I know it gets down to like the 60s every once in a while. But certainly that is one of the biggest differences. So often I hear people who are moving to Georgia from Florida talk about the difference in the seasons. So we have all 4 seasons here in Georgia: spring, summer, fall, winter. And, during October in the fall, the changing of the colors of the leaves, and they all turn kind of like red and yellow. Or in the springtime, it's not super hot. It's not 90 degrees. It's still kind of like a 70s and 80s during March and April. And so this is one of the big differences between Georgia and Florida. Also, I know the humidity is a really big deal in Florida, especially in South Florida. And so very often people are like, oh, I want to get away from the humidity. Well, we still have a lot of humidity here in Georgia. It's not quite as bad as Florida, but don't think that like Georgia has a lot less humidity. It's still pretty humid here. It is still a subtropical climate in Georgia. And so that is something that is certainly a big part of living here in Georgia. What's up, y'all? My name is Victor with Atlanta Suburban Living, and we put out videos every week about what it's like to live in Atlanta and the suburbs of Atlanta. Speaking of the suburbs, another big difference between Florida and Georgia is kind of like the geography or the terrain. In Florida, there is mostly like flat, level ground. And so it's super common to find like a flat backyard, where like everything is super level. Here in Georgia, especially in the North Georgia suburbs, it is very rare to find flat or level terrain or a yard. And so we almost always have everything is on a hill, almost like everywhere, especially in North Georgia. So what this means for, if you're living in Georgia and you have a home, you don't want to have a house that is like at the bottom of a hill or like where the road is above the home. And so when it rains, all of that water flowing towards the home, that's what you want to avoid. You want to try to have a home that is on the top of a hill. Even if it's a slight increase, it's a very big difference. The difference between a slight uphill and a slight downhill is all of that water going toward the home or all of that rainwater going away from the home. And of course, water is the biggest enemy of a home, and so that's certainly something that you need to think about. Also, when it comes to driving, at the time of filming this video, we are kind of getting ready for a big snowstorm, and while it doesn't snow a lot here in Georgia, we do get like freezing rain, which may not be a big deal if the roads were all flat and level, but because everything is on a hill, if we get even the slightest amount of ice on the roads, they're almost impossible to drive on. So it's like being on a roller coaster. If you're driving on the roads here with the ice, it's terrible. So that's why the whole city shuts down. It's a slight difference, but it's enough to make a very big impact on the city. Another very big difference is the insurance issue. I don't know what the hell y'all got going on in Florida, but it's like I've heard property insurance be crazy high, $10,000 a year, $15,000 a year. And so obviously this is because of the hurricane issue. And I know there are a lot of companies who try to take advantage of these hurricanes, and they say, hey, you know what, this slight wind caused some problems with the roof. And so now the insurance companies have to pay for new roofs. And so this is hiking up the insurance there in Florida. Here in Georgia, I have Allstate insurance. I have I think a pretty reasonable deductible, and my yearly insurance is just under $1,000 a year. Now, I've shopped around a lot and compared, and tried to get like the best deal I could. So it's not normal to have property insurance below $1,000 a year, but still, I mean, 1,500 a year, 2,000 a year is super normal here in Metro Atlanta. And while we don't have hurricanes or earthquakes or any really big natural disasters, we do sometimes get the like remnants of hurricanes that hit Florida and then kind of come up the coast. And so almost always, I mean, like at least a couple times a year, we get these tropical storms here in Georgia. They were hurricanes when they hit Florida, and then they get to Georgia and they have become weakened, and so they're tropical storms. This is super normal here in Georgia, and we really don't bat an eye. It's not really a big deal for us here. Everybody kind of tries to stay home, and maybe we try to be careful during the tropical storm, but it's nothing like a hurricane. Another big difference is the infrastructure. As someone who grew up in Florida, and I've got family who still lives in Florida, one of the biggest differences that I see is that the infrastructure in Florida is far better than the infrastructure here in Georgia. So while we don't get hurricanes, these tropical storms do sometimes knock out the power lines because the infrastructure here is so bad. We have like power line poles that are above ground. This is the standard here in Georgia, even around Atlanta, for the power lines to be above ground. And so when there is a tree near those power lines, if the tree falls over, or if any kind of wind knocks these power lines over, we have power outages for like a whole neighborhood or a whole section of a city for maybe a half a day to a day. This is surprisingly not uncommon. I'd say maybe like once a year we have this issue where the power goes out for about half a day. I live in Marietta, so not far from Atlanta, and this is kind of a normal thing that we have to deal with. On top of that, you would think that we would have like high-speed fiber internet everywhere here in Metro Atlanta. Not the case. I think it is normal in Florida for everyone to have high-speed internet. Here in Georgia, we're still working with cable internet in many places. So instead of getting that 250 megabyte download speed, you're getting something like 28 megabyte download speed. I know that is surprising. And so when you're buying a home or you're thinking about moving anywhere here in Georgia, it's super important to check on like the website Comcast or AT&T. Those are the two main providers for internet. You can check on their websites to see if the address where you're considering moving to has high-speed fiber internet. Of course, you could also call me. I'd be happy to help with any questions that you have about moving here to the Metro Atlanta area. We can look up those addresses together or talk about the different areas of Metro Atlanta and figure out which one would be a good fit for you. Even if you just have a question about moving here, feel free to call, text, or email me anytime. Another big difference between Georgia and Florida is certainly the taxes and the economy, jobs. One thing that really affects all of those things, a big factor, is that we have one, maybe two major cities here in Georgia. Atlanta obviously being the capital of Georgia, and so the majority of the economy in Georgia is surrounded around Atlanta or in Atlanta. Whereas in Florida, there are multiple major cities. So you have cities like Miami or, I don't know, Fort Lauderdale. I'm from that area. Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville. You also have the Gulf Coast, like in the panhandle of Florida. And all of these different parts of Florida are like different. Not only is the economy different, but like the culture is different in each one of these different parts. But that affects how the economy is. Here in Georgia, almost all of the state is affected by just one major city, Atlanta. And so overwhelmingly, the most amount of jobs are located in Atlanta and the metro Atlanta area. Also here in Georgia, we have state income tax, whereas in Florida, you guys don't have state income tax, which is killer deal, and I wish that we did not have state income tax, but I think it kind of makes up for it with things like the property taxes and homeowners insurance being a little less here in Georgia. When it comes to the outdoors and recreation, we have a lot of like the woods, and we have a lot of outdoor activities surrounding the lakes and rivers. This is kind of the common thing here in Georgia. In Florida, obviously, you have the ocean. This is a very big part of the outdoor activities that I miss and I love about having lived in Florida. I super miss the ocean. We do have an ocean here in Georgia, like in the Savannah area, but it's not the same. That coast in Georgia around Savannah is more like rugged. It's more like you can't just go on a beach there in Savannah. It's not really accessible like that. It's a lot of undeveloped coastline. And so it's not the same as the ocean in Florida. When it comes to traffic, we have obviously a lot of traffic here in Georgia, and I know there's a lot of traffic in Florida, but the majority of the traffic here in Georgia is in Atlanta and on the interstates that go through Atlanta. But in the suburbs of Atlanta, you don't see nearly as much traffic. Whereas in Florida, I understand that the traffic is kind of like anywhere near a major city, all around it, you can expect a lot of traffic. So very different the way that we see these traffic patterns. And then education is also a big difference. I know in many parts of Florida, they have excellent public schools. I think Florida is kind of known for having some great public schools, whereas in Georgia, it's kind of dicey. There are some parts that have great public schools, and then some parts that have very terrible, outdated, behind the times, very poor public schools. And so I always suggest the areas that are north of Atlanta, so the cities like Marietta, also Alpharetta, Suwannee, essentially Cobb County, North Fulton County, Gwinnett County. In those counties and around those counties, you find excellent public schools. But other than that, you're looking at some schools that are kind of not so great. Whereas in Florida, I understand you can find great public schools all around the state. And then another big one is certainly the demographics. I know Florida is far more diverse, and that's certainly something that I miss as a former Floridian. I've lived here in Georgia now for 30 years, and so that's something that we don't quite do as well here in Georgia. We do have a lot of racial, cultural diversity, but the majority of it is found in the city of Atlanta. In the suburbs of Atlanta, it's not quite as diverse. However, it is still somewhat diverse. Sometimes I say this in the videos and people kind of take it as, oh, the suburbs are like all white. Well, it's not all white in the suburbs of Atlanta. There are other ethnicities, there are other cultures. It's just not as diverse as you would find in Florida. But by far, one of the biggest differences between Florida and Georgia is the cost of living. And this is one of the major factors that brings so many people to Georgia from Florida, is to find that lower cost of living. And I've made an entire video outlining the cost of living here in Georgia and how much you could expect to spend on a monthly basis. You can check out that video right here. I'll see you in the next one.